The 1980s marked a period of growth and development in Tampa Bay, Florida. In 1989, Tampa was already a popular tourist destination with beautiful beaches and diverse attractions like Busch Gardens and the Salvador Dali Museum. The region experienced economic growth with sectors such as tourism, agriculture, shipping, and manufacturing contributing to its prosperity. And amidst this prosperous tourism hotspot, some tourists noticed 3 dead bodies floating in the sea on June 4, 1989. Joan Jo Rogers was born on November 12, 1952, to Wilhelm and Virginia Etzler. Later, she married Hal Rogers, and they settled on a farm in Wilshire, Ohio, living an idyllic life. On February 22, 1972, their first daughter, Michelle, was born. And on October 6, 1974, their second daughter, Christy, was born. Hal and Joan Rogers regularly took good care of their animals. Their daughters, Michelle and Christy, loved the animals on the farm and found great joy in their happy life, despite the hard work on the farm. Michelle, even though she had some tough times, she always looked out for Christy. They both went to school, and Michelle had a boyfriend named Jeff Feesby. However, Michelle had been through something terrible involving her Uncle John, Hal's brother, who had once blindfolded Michelle and assaulted her. Hal and Joan didn't know about it until the police arrested John for attacking another woman from the same town. Due to the disturbing things Michelle had seen, she was very protective of her baby sister. Christy was a bubbling and outgoing girl. She was a cheerleader, loved softball, and was very close to her father. She looked up to Michelle, even though they had their arguments as sisters do. Michelle was sometimes jealous of the attention Christy got from their father, but despite her struggles, Michelle always cared for her little sister. The family faced many challenges on the farm, but Jo was the strongest. She worked long hours at 2 jobs and took care of the family and the animals. She was often exhausted, but she never stopped working. On Friday, May 26, 1989, 36-year-old Jo Rogers and her 2 daughters, 17-year-old Michelle and 15-year-old Christy, went on a long-awaited road trip to Florida. They left their farm in Ohio and were looking forward to enjoying a family vacation. Jo, who worked the night shift at a distribution center, was excited to give her girls their first vacation. They left Jo's husband, Hal, to take care of the farm and drove their Oldsmobile Calais south on Interstate 75. Their plans included visiting theme parks and enjoying the Florida sun. They visited the Jacksonville Zoo, Silver Springs, SeaWorld, Epcot, and Disney's MGM Studios, having a great time away from farm responsibilities. On June 1st, they reached the motel in Tampa and were thinking about going to Busch Gardens. Michelle called her boyfriend Jeff to have a conversation with him. At 12:57 p.m., the family made another call to Busch Gardens. At night, the Rogers women were seen happily dining at the motel's restaurant by a businessman. But after that evening, they mysteriously disappeared. The last photo they took in their motel was Michelle getting ready for their next adventure. Sadly, they never got to see the sunrise again. Hal Rogers anxiously waited for Jo and his daughters to return from their Florida vacation. Even though he hadn't heard from them for days, he tried to stay positive, hoping they were all right. As time passed, his worries grew and he wondered where they could be. On June 4, 1989, the Amber Waves, a sailboat returning to Tampa from Key West, spotted something troubling in the water. They saw what looked like a body of a woman floating face down. Her hands were tied behind her back, her feet bound, and a thin yellow rope was around her neck. She was unclothed from the waist down. Someone on the Amber Waves radioed the Coast Guard, and a rescue boat was sent from the Bayboro Harbor Station in St. Petersburg. The Coast Guard crew located the body and had difficulty retrieving it. There was something heavy attached to the rope around her neck, making it hard to bring her up. They noted the location and cut the line around her neck, placing her in a body bag before heading back to the station. However, before reaching the shore, they received another distressing message. Another female body had been spotted by 2 people on a sailboat. This time, it was 2 miles off the pier in St. Petersburg. Like the first body, this one was also face down, bound with a rope around the neck and naked from the waist down. The same Coast Guard crew went to recover it. As they were dealing with the second body, another call came in, a third female floating on a short distance away to the east. Once the third body was also recovered, All 3 bodies were brought to the Coast Guard station for examination and to be photographed by the arriving investigators from the Florida Marine Patrol. They were in a state of decomposition, making identification challenging. The women's hands and feet were tied in a similar manner, and the second woman had managed to free one hand before dying. Duct tape covered their mouths, and the second and third bodies had concrete blocks tied to the ropes around their necks. It was believed that the first body also had a concrete block tied to its rope. Detectives suspected that the woman may have been assaulted and then thrown alive into the water with concrete blocks tied to their necks, causing them to drown. The discovery of the 3 murdered women shocked the community, leading to a massive investigation. Divers searched the waters for evidence, and police boats looked for more bodies in the bay. Autopsies were conducted to find out how they died and gather more clues. Since the bodies had no IDs, detectives tried to identify them through their clothing and jewelry. One of the women, the oldest, had long brown hair and was found in a black t-shirt with a gold wedding band on her left hand. Another had medium-length brown hair, wore a peach-colored shirt, and had 3 cloth bracelets with pink, green, and white stripes on her left wrist. The third woman, the youngest, had wavy brown hair and was dressed in a black tank top over a blue bikini top. She had 4 rings on her left hand, 2 gold and 2 silver, 1 on each finger. The struggle she put up allowed her to free one hand from the rope around her wrist, while Joe Rogers' husband, Hal, waited anxiously at the farm. He grew more worried as the days passed without any news from Joe and the girls. He called Joe's friends and relatives to check if they had heard from her, confirmed with her boss at the distribution center about her return date, and reported them missing to the authorities, but nobody had any information. Then, early one night that week, Jeff Feesby, Michelle's boyfriend, called Hal. He had received a postcard from Michelle with a picture of a girl in a bikini and a bull gator and the words "Fun Times in Florida" on the front. Hal asked Jeff to bring it to the house. As he read the postcard repeatedly, he couldn't find any clues about what might have happened. Feeling desperate and determined to do something, he went to his bank on Wednesday and withdrew some money. He had a plan in mind. Hal decided to conduct his own search from the air. He would find a private plane and a pilot, and together they would fly over the roads that Joe and the girls had taken from Ohio to Florida. On Thursday, June 8th, the maid at the Days Inn, Tampa, noticed something strange about room 251. The guest had checked in a week ago, but the room seemed untouched since then. The beds were neat, the bathroom was unused, and personal items were left behind. The maid became suspicious and shared her concerns with the hotel's general manager. They decided to call the Tampa police to report the guest might be missing, especially given the recent news about the 3 bodies found in the bay. The Tampa police arrived and realized that the room could hold crucial information about the women's identities. They sealed off the room and called for support from detectives in both Tampa and St. Petersburg. The investigators carefully searched the room, taking photographs, collecting fingerprints, and examining all personal belongings. A technician matched the prints found in the room, including those on a tube of an Oral-B Sesame Street toothpaste with the prints taken from the bodies in the bay. It was confirmed that the room belonged to the same 3 women. Meanwhile, the detectives started to make initial identifications using the information found in their purses and the registration from the front desk. Once they identified that the 3 women were Joe, Michelle, and Christy, they now called Hal in Ohio. On that same day, 2 significant events occurred in Tampa Bay. Firstly, the police started looking for the car the women drove when coming to Florida. They were able to gather information about its make, model, and license plate from the motel registration form. Unfortunately, the car was not found in the Days Inn parking lot, so they expanded their search to the nearby areas and eventually located it at a boat ramp along the Courtney Campbell Parkway just a few miles away. The car seemed untouched since Joe and the girls had left it there a week ago. It was locked and the passenger seat was pushed forward as if someone had recently gotten out from the back seat. Inside the car, they found a Clearwater Beach brochure, a deck of Uno cards, and a puzzle book that someone had been working on in the back seat. On the front passenger seat, there was a piece of Days Inn stationery with directions written by Joe herself, guiding them from the motel to a boat ramp. The direction said, "Turn right, west on 60, 2.5 miles on right side, alt before, bridge." Besides these words, there was one more instruction, blue with white. Now, one thing seemed likely. The individual responsible for this crime probably owned a blue and white boat. The second major breakthrough, which was quite shocking, occurred when one of the investigators received a call from the chief of detectives at the Van Wert County Sheriff's Office. The detective wanted to ensure that the team investigating the homicides knew all the relevant facts about the Rogers family. He shared information about Michelle and her uncle, John Rogers, who is now in prison for assaulting a woman. He had also previously blindfolded Michelle and assaulted her. Although John was in prison at the time of the murders, the investigators couldn't overlook the striking similarities between what happened to Michelle on the farm and the events in Tampa Bay. In both cases, Michelle seemed to have been bound and assaulted. This raised the possibility that John might have orchestrated the murders from behind bars, possibly arranging for someone with a boat to take them out on the water. To get a clearer picture, they needed to learn more about the Rogers family. Understanding Joe, Michelle, and Christy better could lead them to discover how they ended up on the bay that night. Alone was someone who intended to harm them. The very next day after identifying the bodies, 2 detectives flew to Ohio to delve deeper into the Rogers family. The detectives questioned Hal about his brother, John Rogers. Hal clearly stated that John was a loner, and at the time of the missing and eventual death of the Rogers women, he was in jail. There was no way he could plan a murder from inside the cell, as he had no connections with his prison mates. But during their inquiries, the detectives discovered unsettling information about Hal himself. They learned that Hal had posted John's bail when he was accused of assaulting a woman, and despite later learning about the allegations involving Michelle, he kept his word to support John. Hal explained that he wanted to keep peace within the family and believed that someone was lying. He had also said that he had already promised Joe that he would pay for his bail before he knew about the Michelle incident, and so he had kept his word. Another peculiar incident was a $7,000 cash withdrawal Hal made while the girls were missing. He explained that he needed the money to search for his family in Florida, as he didn't believe in credit cards. However, before he could carry out his plan, he learned of their deaths. After numerous interviews with Hal, the detectives found no concrete evidence implicating him in the murders. They observed his grief-stricken demeanor and accepted his explanation for the bond and the cash withdrawal. When the detectives asked him where the $7,000 went, Hal took them to the back of his truck. Inside it was a bag that had $6,000, and the rest was in Hal's pocket. After interviews in Ohio, detectives cleared Hal and John Rogers as suspects in the Florida murders. In October 1989, lead detective John Capel discovered a crucial lead while going through a bulletin from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. The bulletin mentioned an assault on a 24-year-old Canadian woman off Madeira Beach that occurred on May 15, 1989, just 2 weeks before the Rogers women were murdered. The description of the attackers matched the Rogers women were last seen in. Capel and another detective flew to Canada to interview the victim and became convinced that the same man responsible for the assault was likely involved in the Rogers murder. The Canadian woman had met a man named David Posner at 7 to 11 in Madeira Beach. He was older, had tint windows on his dark-colored four-wheel drive vehicle, and claimed to own an aluminium company and lived in Bradenton. He offered to take her on a boat ride the next afternoon. When she arrived, her friend decided not to go, so she went alone. After a seemingly pleasant trip, the man's demeanor changed and he assaulted her. He threatened her, bound her with duct tape, and forced her to comply. When they returned to the shore, he even apologized for his actions. The woman was able to escape and provided the detectives with enough information to create a composite sketch of her attacker. Back in Florida, the detectives realized there was no individual named David Posner who matched the attacker's description. They decided to release the composite drawing and description of the man, his boat, and his vehicle to the public. This resulted in 400 tips pouring in, leading to a surge of activity in the investigation. However, despite their efforts, none of the leads seemed to pan out, and the case hit another dead end. As time passed, the number of detectives assigned to the case dwindled. Nearly 6 months after the murders on December 23, 1989, the case seemed all but forgotten until Sergeant Glenn Moore took charge. Though lacking homicide experience, Moore refused to let the case fade away. He sought to reinvigorate the investigation, hoping to finally identify and apprehend the elusive suspect responsible for the heinous crimes. In October 1990, Joanne Steffi, a Tampa resident, saw a newspaper clipping of a composite drawing related to an assault case in Madeira Beach. She believed the sketch resembled one of her neighbors, a man who had recently moved in the area with his family. Despite feeling uneasy about him, Steffi hesitated to report her suspicions to the police, fearing involvement in the investigation. Later, during a chance encounter with a Hillsborough County Sheriff's deputy in her accounting class, Steffi confided in him about her neighbor's resemblance to the composite drawing. She asked the deputy to pass along the information without revealing her identity, hoping to remain uninvolved. Unfortunately, the tip somehow did not reach Sergeant Glenn Moore and his team, who were working on the Rogers murders case. They were overwhelmed with numerous tips and decided to utilize a new software called Holmes to organize their information better. They also sought assistance from the FBI's behavioral unit in Quantico. During this time, they interviewed Hal Rogers again and questioned around 70 people in Ohio to gain insights into the emotional states of Joe Rogers and her daughters. Meanwhile, a local newspaper, the Tribune, published an article pointing suspicions toward Hal Rogers, leading investigators to put Hal through a polygraph test to clear his name. After Hal passed the test, Sergeant Moore held a press conference to affirm that Hal was never a suspect but a victim in the case. It was 1991, around a year and a half passed since Joanne Steffi had shared her suspicions with the sheriff's deputy, but there had been no action taken yet. The man she found suspicious had already moved away with his family, having hardly interacted with others despite being amiable with people around him. The investigation into the Rogers murders continued, with Sergeant Moore sharing information received from Quantico during a press conference. Steffi's tip remained unaddressed as she wondered if the police were conducting background checks on the man she suspected. But again, gradually the case's progress was getting slower and slower. It was the spring of 1992. It had now been 3 years since the investigation started. The investigators had received 1,500 tips in this time, but still were nowhere close to identifying the assailant. However, they made progress in profiling the killer, concluding it was the work of a single man, based on the way the hands and legs were tied. They suspected that the person who gave directions to the Rogers family was the same individual who later lured them out. A distinctive handwriting on the directions prompted them to conduct a handwriting test. Sergeant Moore announced the new theory at a press conference, suggesting that the killers were likely charming, likable, and appeared respectable and harmless. Back in March 1992, Joanne Steffi's sister called the police to say that Steffi knew a man who resembled the suspect's sketches. The police tried to reach Steffi, but they couldn't get through. On May 14, 1992, it had almost been 2.5 years since Steffi had tipped the police about her neighbor. Now Steffi saw the news and Sergeant Moore's press conference in the newspaper and wondered if she should report her suspicion again. Steffi recalled her former neighbor, who was an aluminium contractor, and thought his handwriting might match the one in the composite sketch. She talked to Eileen Prisbes, a civilian investigator, about her neighbor, whose name was Oba Chandler in the contract, his boat, and his SUV. She found the contract and check from when Chandler built a port for her neighbor, Moselle Smith. Steffi compared the handwriting from the contract and the press conference clipping, and she was convinced it was the same. Steffi called the task force again and told Prisbes about the contract and handwriting. She wanted to provide a lead. They faxed the contract and checked to the investigators, but the task force was dealing with a flood of tips, so it took time to look into Steffi's information among the other leads. Meanwhile, the investigators used billboards to seek public help in finding the killer. Joanne Steffi and Moselle Smith had already shared their suspicions, but there was a backlog of tips. Frustrated, they sent the handwriting samples again, which now caught the attention of the task force. Investigator Prisbes re-evaluated the writing, but couldn't make a definite match. The lead was handed to another investigator, J.J. Gogan, to follow up. On Friday, July 31st, Gogan visited Moselle Smith in Tampa to obtain the original contract related to Oba Chandler. Upon comparing the contract's handwriting with the directions on the brochure, the task force found strong similarities, leading them to consider Oba Chandler as a new suspect. They quickly gathered more information about him, discovering he was a 45-year-old man living with his family in Port Orange near Daytona Beach. Oba Chandler became a significant suspect in the investigation of the Rogers women's murders. At the time of the murders, he lived on Dalton Avenue, close to where Joe and the girls vanished, just 2 miles from the boat ramp. Records showed that he owned a 21-foot Bayliner boat with a blue and white interior and a dark blue Jeep Cherokee. He had an extensive criminal history, including charges of kidnapping, burglary, armed robbery, and counterfeiting. They compared a picture of Chandler with a composite sketch, and it was a perfect match. After 3 years of relentless investigation, Sergeant Moore was convinced they had their man. Another fact emerged. The man who had assaulted the Canadian woman before also owned an aluminium company, similar to Chandler's line of work as an aluminium contractor. To keep his real name hidden and avoid alerting Chandler, they referred to him as the Tin Man. The task force expanded rapidly, collaborating with the state attorney's office to build a strong case against Chandler. Chandler had a troubled past, with a history of crimes and a penchant for frightening and threatening people. Investigators spread across Florida and the Midwest collecting evidence against him. Born on October 11, 1946, in Cincinnati, Ober Jr. had a tumultuous childhood with his father taking his own life when he was young. He got into trouble early on, stealing cars and facing numerous arrests. As an adult, he faced a long list of charges, including possession of counterfeit money and armed robbery. Chandler married Deborah and Whiteman on May 14, 1988, just 10 days after she had divorced her husband. They bought a house on Dalton Avenue, close to Joanne Steffi, who later reported her suspicions about Chandler. Chandler's house had a canal leading to Tampa Bay, where he had a 21-foot Bayliner boat during the time of the Rogers murders. He sold the boat shortly after the crimes. He also owned a dark blue Jeep Cherokee during the same period, resembling the vehicle described by the Canadian tourist who was assaulted. Investigators had now gathered enough evidence to consider Oba Chandler as the prime suspect in the Rogers women's murders. In the summer of 1990, as news about the Rogers investigation and its upcoming feature on Unsolved Mysteries spread, Chandler, his wife, and young daughter Whitney left their home on Dalton Avenue. They stopped making mortgage payments, leading the bank to foreclose and sell the house. Chandler moved to Florida's East Coast in July 1990, initially living in Broward County before settling in Port Orange near Daytona Beach. Despite his credit issues by October 1991, he leased a house in his daughter's name. Chandler appeared normal to his neighbors, although they didn't know what he did for a living. Now in 1992, investigators confirmed his handwriting and fingerprints matched evidence from the case, leading to surveillance of his new home with phone monitoring. In early September 1992, while other tasks were ongoing, 2 investigators, Detective Katie Connor-Dubina and FDLE agent John Halliday, traveled to Toronto to speak with the Canadian tourist who had been assaulted at the Madeira Beach in May 1989, just 2 weeks before the murders. The woman, now 27 and married, worked as a social worker. They showed her 6 pictures of different men and asked her to identify the person involved in the incident. When she saw the 3rd photo, she became visibly upset and confirmed that this was her assaulter. The photograph featured Oba Chandler. She signed the photo and asked to turn it over as it was disturbing her. A large team of about 40 to 50 law enforcement officers from various agencies, including the St. Petersburg Police, FDLE, and the FBI, were now surveilling Chandler around the clock. They had a command post near his house with a video camera monitoring his driveway. Whenever Chandler left, multiple unmarked cars followed him, carefully rotating to avoid being noticed. The FBI provided 2 small planes that took turns tracking Chandler from above, ensuring they never lost sight of him. They communicated with the ground units using the radio, saying, "Eagle has the eyeball." After setting up surveillance, prosecutors arrived in Volusia County with an arrest warrant for Chandler on the charges of assault. Investigators planned to question him, showing photos of the victim to prompt him to talk to the FBI's Daytona Beach office. It was Thursday, September 17, 1992, the day that police had planned to question Chandler. That morning, just before Chandler was to be arrested, an unexpected event took place. As Chandler left his house in his blue Toyota Corolla, the surveillance teams debated whether to arrest him immediately or continue following him. They decided to keep trailing him, hoping he'd lead them to something significant. Chandler drove for a long time, and when he reached Lake City, the officers faced difficulties due to low fuel in the plane and a thunderstorm. They lost sight of Chandler in the heavy rain, and panic set in. They searched frantically but couldn't find him. Frustration and anger spread amongst the investigators, wondering if they missed their chance. They had to wait, monitoring Chandler's home, hoping he would return. Meanwhile, mysterious calls from Cincinnati and northern Kentucky added to the tension. The fear of Chandler potentially harming someone else haunted them. After losing Chandler for a week, the investigators received a call from Georgia, indicating he was returning. On September 24, 1992, they planned to arrest him without wasting any more time. Police waited for him on the I-95, but he took a different route. At a gas station in Port Orange, officers surrounded his car and arrested him for assault and battery. Back at the FBI office, they tried to make him talk, but he remained calm and asked for a lawyer. On the drive back to Pinellas County, Chandler talked casually with an FBI agent, even offering to provide information about a car scheme. The agent couldn't believe his audacity. Despite Chandler's complaints, his handcuffs remained secure. The next morning, Chandler had his initial hearing in a small courtroom at the Pinellas County Jail. The judge read the affidavit and kept bail at $1 million. Investigators found Chandler's blue and white Bayliner boat with a yellow Volvo engine. Inside his house in Port Orange, they discovered a mint green mesh shirt. The Canadian woman and her friend identified Chandler in a lineup. One of Chandler's many children, Crystal Mays, revealed that he visited her in 1989, admitting he was on the run for assault and possible killings. Her husband, Rick Mays, said Chandler confessed to assaulting women in his boat and throwing one overboard, mentioning he had murdered 3 women. With this new evidence, Chandler was indicted on 3 counts of first-degree murder in November, but the trial would not take place for another 2 years. It was the spring of 1994, several months before the trial was scheduled to begin. The prosecution now had access to Chandler's phone bills. While studying the bills, they noticed something strange. On May 15, 1989 and June 2, 1989, several collect calls were made to Chandler's house at specific times: 5:49 p.m. and 1:12 a.m., 1:30 a.m., 1:38 a.m., 8:11 a.m., and 9:52 a.m., respectively. All these calls were traced back to a special billing number, 813-223-0000, used for marine phone calls. The prosecution wanted to know who made these calls. They discovered that the calls had to be made through a marine phone operator, but unfortunately the records were destroyed. After persistent efforts, they found backup copies and were astonished to see that the May 15th call was made from a boat named Gypsy 1, with the caller identifying himself as Oba. The June 2nd calls were also from Gypsy 1, with the 5th call identifying the person as Obi. On September 19, 1994, Chandler's trial began. During the trial, the prosecution acted swiftly, calling around 20 witnesses each day. They presented evidence like the directions found on the brochure in Joe Rogers' car, the palm print on the brochure, and Chandler's call from his boat. Chandler's daughter Crystal Mays testified about his shocking confession in Cincinnati, where he admitted to physical assault and possibly murder. In jail, too, witnesses had heard himself incriminate himself, talking about assaulting a foreign woman and mentioning the Rogers case. A laborer, Rollins Cooper, shared how Chandler spoke about a date with 3 women on the day of the disappearance. The Canadian tourist bravely testified about her terrifying encounter with Chandler. Hal Rogers, Michelle's husband, remained strong in court, thanking the brave Canadian woman. In a crowded courtroom, Chandler testified in his defense, appearing calm and composed. He confirmed meeting the Rogers family when they asked for directions to Days Inn in Tampa. He thought they meant a different one at first, but one of the girls clarified and directed them toward Rocky Point. Chandler explained that he was returning from a job estimate when he encountered them at a gas station near Interstate 4 in East Tampa. During his testimony, Oba Chandler denied any involvement in the murders and refuted allegations made by witnesses. He explained a fishing trip gone wrong on the night of June 1, 1989. After finishing fishing that night, Chandler encountered a problem with his boat. He attempted to start the engine, but it only sputtered briefly before stopping. Investigating further, he noticed a strong smell of gas and found that a fuel hose had burst, causing the entire 40-gallon tank to leak into the space beneath the boat's deck. Scott Hopkins, the investigator, noticed something odd in Chandler's testimony about the fuel leak in his boat. Knowing the boat well, Hopkins was certain Chandler was lying. He immediately informed the lead prosecutor during the lunch break, and a mechanic was sent to reinvestigate Chandler's boat. After the lunch break, the prosecutor wasted no time in beginning the cross-examination. Chandler reluctantly admitted to his past felony convictions, and the prosecutor pushed him about the murder accusations made by his daughter and son-in-law, to which Chandler invoked the Fifth Amendment. The prosecutors then questioned the events of June 1, 1989, and exposed contradictions in Chandler's story about the fuel leak and his whereabouts. Evidence revealed that Chandler had made calls from the water before getting help, challenging his claims of being at a different location. The prosecutor also confronted Chandler about his escape to Cincinnati after the composite drawing of the Madeira Beach suspect was released. Chandler tried to downplay his fear, but the prosecutor implied they might have found their suspect. During a crucial moment, the prosecution team informed the lead prosecutor of a breakthrough regarding Chandler's boat. The mechanic had returned after checking the boat. Armed with this information, he cornered Chandler, asking about the broken fuel line.